Hello BookTube, it's Roz, and it's about I think it's the 27th of June today, or is it the 28th? Anyway, not quite the end of the month, but I'm going to do my June wrap-up, delights, discoveries of the month, any disappointments now, because I know that anything else I read this month is going to be BookTube prize reading, which I can't talk about anyway. So I might as well get on and get this done early rather than late for a change. Go me. Now, June has been an excellent reading month, and in these videos I always sort of kind of often start with, has there been a disappointment or even a disaster, but you know, rarely have those, but anything that hasn't really lived up to expectations or whatever. And I really think that there hasn't been one of those this month. I've finished 9 different books this month, and then I've got 3 other things on the go, one of which I will finish this month, I would say. It's BookTube Prize one, and the other 2 are ongoing, like long-term poetry projects, so I won't. But so that's my month. My usual mix of current fiction, some poetry, a play, a bit of non-fiction, yeah, some old, some new, yeah. Slightly more non-fiction than usual this month. I've actually read three, which, you know, I usually read more kind of fiction and poetry than I do non-fiction, and that's true, but slightly more. And I'm going to start by telling you about what I think is possibly the best non-fiction book that I read this month, and one that I would really like to recommend if the topic interests you as it interested me. And this book is called Wayfinding, and it has the sort of subtitle, as it were. No, it's not a subtitle. What's the word? I mean, it doesn't matter, does it? Is The Art and Science of How We Find and Lose Our Way. It's by Michael Bond. It came out in 2020. It's a work of, I suppose, popular science, and as it says, it is all about navigation and how we do that. It's the kind of popular science book I really enjoy, in that it's someone who's interested in the subject and he's read and researched, not original research, you know, he's looked into the sort of all the current thinking around this subject, and then brings it together, you know, from different disciplines, brings that together in a nice, digestible and engaging form for your general reader like me. And so, for example, he goes into the neuroscience of how we find our way. I mean, did you know, perhaps you do, but I didn't, that we have cells, you know, neurons that identify boundaries and that identify the direction we're pointing, you know, that ones that kind of like ones that effectively go ping every time we go a certain distance, so we know how far we've gone. Oh, the neuroscience really fast. A lot of it's based on like rats, because you can't, you know, go into the same investigation of human brains, but oh, I was delighted by that. He looks at how our way of life affects how well we learn to navigate, you know, with the extreme being the Polynesians, and who took navigation at sea to, you know, the highest level of any sort of society or culture ever. But, you know, he's saying even now, you know, in the West, our ability to navigate is probably changing partly because of what we learn or do as children. So, like when I was a child, growing up in the sort of born in the 1960s, I pretty much had freedom to roam my neighbourhood as I chose. I could go a few miles from home if I wanted to, and you know, nobody, you know, and had to find my way and find my way home again. And you gradually kind of work your way outwards from your home on different routes, don't you? And that teaches you a lot about to observe and remember and think, and in finding your way. A child born in the same place today probably barely goes any distance from their house at all without an adult accompanying them. That really changes things, doesn't it? And then sat-nav is going to change things even more in terms of how we think about journeys. You know, the Inuit elders are concerned that, you know, they know how they learned, you know, huge numbers of routes across what to us would be, you know, relatively featureless, icy landscape. But, you know, they could do that, and that the youngsters now, you know, will go out on their snowmobile, and if, you know, the sat-nav goes, they've got no way of finding their way back anymore. Really interesting. Strongly recommend it as a book. It's not a long read, and I really enjoyed it. Second interesting non-fiction book I read this month was a memoir, and that was The Country Under My Skin by Gioconda Belli. And a couple of months ago, I read Belli's novel, The Inhabited Woman, and was so intrigued by that, which I knew was kind of semi-autobiographical, that as was Robin, that I read that with, that we decided to read her actual memoir, which came out in 2001, and Alba of Seriella joined us, and what a rich and interesting life Belli has had, from being a kind of upper class Nicaraguan girl, you know, expected to, you know, study and maybe work, but, you know, get married and go to parties, and, you know, to becoming a Sandinista revolutionary, as it were, and taking part in the overthrow of the Somoza dictatorship in Nicaragua, and her part in that, what that meant for her as a person, as a woman, as a mother. I suppose an inside story of being part of a movement like that. Really interesting. She really conjured up the place and the people, and, you know, that was all really good. I think that all three of us reading it all had issues with some of her retelling, and recognizing that, you know, it's quite hard in you know, that many years later, you know, 30 years later, to be to recapture how you thought and felt when you were 18 or 20 or 30. And she probably is being quite honest about it, but I think we were almost disappointed at how often she, you know, as a feminist revolutionary, she allowed her relationships with men to be the thing to really influence her decision making and behaviour, I suppose. But then on reflection, you know, I think to myself, well, I've never risked my life to overthrow an oppressive dictatorship, so you know, who am I to grumble at her, you know, how she portrays her choices? And it was definitely a very, a rewarding read. You know, and yeah, I've never lived in a kind of very patriarchal, macho Central American kind of culture that sets certain sort of expectations on women and so on. So I wondered whether I might have picked that as being, you know, the sort of the disappointment of the mother. And I thought, no, actually it wasn't. It's just, you know, recognising that difference, and yeah, a life that was well worth reading about. She's still writing, and it's quite critical now of Daniel Ortega and his current almost dictator-like behaviour as president of Nicaragua. So that must create real kind of tensions for her to have the revolution that she risked so much for kind of maybe falling into the same problems that it originally sought to overthrow. The next non-fiction book I read this month was one of my pride choices. So I kind of got involved in 3 themed reading things this month, I suppose. And one was Pride, one was Ancients-a-thon, and one was Caribathon. And Dutiful Boy was a pride choice. And it's by Mohsin Zaidi. It came out in 2020. He's a British Pakistani man. He's now a barrister. He's Muslim and he's gay. And he has written a memoir of his kind of childhood through to young adulthood, and how all those different bits of his life have had to mesh, but how that has sometimes been extremely painful and difficult. He's someone who grew up in a very loving but very religious family, and he almost fought against what he knew to be his sexuality because it was considered wrong, you know, in his religion, a religion that he also kind of subscribed to at the time. So the psychological tensions of that are enormous. He also had the whole experience of being a relatively sort of badly off, you know, going to like a sort of inner city comprehensive, but being you know, academically able, and ultimately going to Oxford, studying law, you know, and then you know, eventually becoming a barrister. So that sort of class shift, he was doing a class shift as well, although to be fair, his grandfather in Pakistan had also been a lawyer, so you know, it's not, but yeah, in that whole thing of being yes a brown person at Oxford who hadn't been to public school. There's another set of tensions in his life. It's very clear, reading the book, that Zaidi is quite a charismatic person, and all through his life he kind of found people to take him under their wing and encourage him and support him, and he also had a very, you know, the love of his family. So even though they then you know, had a degree of conflict, that was always there for him, and he conveys that in that this book is not a misery memoir, and it's also not a sort of uplifting story of I survived. All those things are anathema to me. I really hate books like that and won't read them, and this was not that kind of book. He writes really well. He writes, I guess it's brave, and there is a part of his reason, I think, for writing the book is to be there for other young gay Muslim boys who need to read about a story like his. But, you know, it's a delight to read. It's funny, it's moving, and possibly yes, one reason I need to be grateful is next time I'm doing one of those tags and it says, oh, which was the last book that made you cry? I'll have an answer. I'll have an answer. It'll be A Suitable Boy by Mohsin Zaidi. But cry in a good way, I guess. Yeah, it was moving. My other pride choices were all fiction. And second one I'm going to mention, it was The Pull of the Stars by Emma Donoghue. Now, I can't say much about this book because it was a BookTube prize read. But what I will say is that, you know, Donoghue's a lesbian woman from Ireland, although she lives now in Canada. This is a book that came out in 2020. It's quite a dark book, but it's the relationships between women and the love affairs, loving relationships between women. One that's kind of explicit in the story and one is kind of alluded to. They are the nuggets of joy in what is quite a dark story. But I will say no more. I can say more about the other Pride Choice novel that I read, which is Detransition Baby by Torrey Peters, published I think in 2021 at the very beginning of the year. It's been one of those books that has popped up quite a bit on BookTube, with some people absolutely adoring it and other people thinking that perhaps it wasn't that good. Yeah, a Marmite book. It's also caused controversy because it was longlisted, maybe shortlisted, no, but longlisted for the Women's Prize for Fiction, and you know, it's by a trans woman, and there were people that said, you know, does this belong in the Women's Prize for Fiction? I mean, of course it does, but you know, that was the subject of some controversy, shall we say. Well, what did I make of it? I can completely understand why there have been some wildly different opinions about this book expressed on BookTube and elsewhere. It's one of those books that is definitely not a perfect novel. About a month ago, I made a video with Tilly, my daughter. You'll find it on Tilly's shelf, where we attempted to name 5 perfect novels. And I think one of the conclusions we came to in doing that is that the most memorable novels, your favourite novels, are not necessarily the perfect ones. And this book epitomises that, in that I have a feeling when I look back at my year's reading at the end of 2021, you know, and I'll be going down the list and looking at things I've read, and it's like, oh yeah, that was good, I like that, you know, and I'll hit Detransition Baby and it'll go, boom, yes, that was one of the most memorable and significant things that I read this year. But it definitely has its flaws as a novel, and they did not outweigh its pleasures and value for me, I suppose. It's a bit first novelly, and Peters has published things before, but it was self-published. This is her first sort of big novel, if that makes sense. And you can see that. And what it feels like is that she has this kind of pent-up set of ideas and thoughts and stories and emotions and things that she wants to say, and you know, and they all got poured into this book, and it was a joy and a privilege to be carried along on that ride. But there were moments when you thought, like, oh, that was one of those things that you've written down as like, this is a good bit that I want to use in a book sometime, and you put it in, but perhaps it doesn't entirely fit. Or, you know, bits where you're explaining a bit too much here, more than I need. Just trust your readers a bit more. I was reading this as a buddy read with Mark Nash, Brian of Bookish, and Sina of Beating Around the Books, and that was really helpful in kind of unpicking some of that and looking at some of the ideas in this book, because it's a very frank, honest, open book. And at the beginning, I suppose I felt like there was almost like sort of info dumps about trans experience, and which I wasn't sure about, not sure that they were the right experience, but you know, like, how is this, you know, is this working as a novel? And I think I felt like that because I was perhaps thinking that she was somehow trying to explain things to cis readers, And then as I read on, I think I came to realise that isn't true. She wasn't writing with me as her audience. She was writing for herself and potentially for a trans audience. I think where she does things that felt perhaps like too much explanation or like info dump, that actually possibly she had in mind a reader who is younger, or less certain, or less sort of far along a journey towards understanding themselves and sort of expressing their trans identity, you know, as a woman, so that perhaps she was sometimes speaking to that in a way that would be supportive, and that's a theme in the book about like mothers in the trans community, like, you know, looking after kind of like younger, newer, their younger, newer sisters or daughters, shall we say. And that's one of the themes. It's a complex book. It's a fascinating book. I learnt things that I didn't know. Now I've you know, it's not like I don't know trans women and trans men, but there's things that they, I guess, would never say, that, I don't know, wouldn't come up in conversation, or you wouldn't, I don't know, it just wouldn't be appropriate maybe, or, you know, but just you wouldn't know. And whereas in a novel you can say all that, and Torrey Peters does, and so that was its sort of benefit for me as a reader. But also, you know, it is richly characterized and with a kind of, yeah, an interesting story. So that's that one. Now, my fourth pride choice was an unexpected one, because I didn't choose it as a pride choice. I chose this for Ancients-a-thon, and that is the Epic of Gilgamesh. We're talking a 4,000-year-old story here, so, you know, who'd have thunk it? It would turn out to be a story with a kind of strong, I don't know, homoerotic kind of plot thread, characterization thread. It's about a legendary Sumerian king and his friend, soulmate, and I think lover, who was made, like, Gilgamesh is this larger than life, kind of super masculine, handsome, strong king, but he's wearing out all the boys and girls of his city with his sort of energy in every way. And so the gods decide to make him someone who will be his match. And when they first meet, oh, such a cliche, they have to wrestle. They have to wrestle each other to the ground and then decide that they can be best friends. And when, yeah, they become inseparable. And when in the story Enkidu dies, Gilgamesh mourns him as a lover without a doubt. And yeah, so it turned out to be a pride read as well. I've done a scally-dandling video about Gilgamesh, so I'll say nothing more about that. But it was one of my two Ancients-a-thon choices. My other Ancients-a-thon choice was The Rover by Afra Ben. So the other end of the period that Ancients-a-thon was sort of asking us to read, as in Gilgamesh is just about the oldest thing, the oldest kind of substantive work of fiction you can read. And The Rover was from the 1670s, 1677, I think that came out. It's a play. It's by a English woman who supported herself through her playwriting. I really enjoyed it. I've made a video with Tilly for our Discussing Drama series. It's on Tilly's shelf. I'll link to it below, so I will say nothing more about that one either. Which brings me to the third kind of event that I took part in, which was Caribathon. And for Caribathon, I read something that I've meant to read for years. And you know that thing where you're slightly intimidated by something, so you don't get around to it, but you want to, and then you use like a readathon to spur you to do it. and that was Omeros by Walcott, and that's his epic poem. It's big, it's chunky, it's dense, it's brilliant, but it's not an easy read. I was carried through it by reading it alongside Stephanie Cohen, who's a BookTube commenter, and oh, thank you so much, Stephanie, for making Omeros work for me, and I think I did the same for you. I've done a poetry challenge, little mini video in which I read a little bit from Omeros and talk a little bit about it, but so I won't say a lot. But what I will say is that Walcott's extraordinary achievement, I suppose, with Omeros is that he draws on his background as someone who grew up in St. Lucia. He draws on St. Lucian history, traditions, culture of both the black St. Lucians that were brought there as slaves, and the Arawak sort of Indian background of the island as well, the physicality of the island, the plants, the birds. He uses all of that. He also uses his sort of literary forebears in terms of Western literature. You know, he draws on Homer, obviously it's Omeros. He draws on Dante, Gilgamesh features, Milton, Paradise Lost and so on, the Bible. He draws on all of that, and he uses it to write a beautiful story, but to explore colonialism, exile, but also a very personal story about himself and kind of coming to terms, I suppose, with being a poet and being a poet who's living away from where he comes from. And there's a kind of a lovely resolution. I love the imagery. There's certain recurring images all the way through the poem. One is the swift, the bird, the swift. There are many. Read it, but if possible, read it with a friend to help you get you past the sort of when you have to kind of climb a bit of a hill to start to really enjoy a book. It's one of those. That was all the sort of different. Oh, I said I read 9 books, and you'll be thinking that's not 9. Okay, Gilgamesh I read 2 different versions, so that's why it's 8 things but 9 books. Got a couple of ongoing things that are rolling on. One is reading Dante with Tom of LA Books, as you know. The other is The Dream Songs by John Berryman, and that I'm kind of reading with Alan of Big Old Books and Classics. And again, I did a Poetry Thursday reading for that, so I won't say any more than that, other than to thank Alan for making that happen, and to say I'm so happy I've had such a rich and enjoyable month's reading. I hope yours has been equally delightful, and do tell me about it, or tell me if you've read any of these things too and want to comment about them.